All right, good morning, agents. This is Kevin Lauren. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing here at Alta Realty Group. And today we're going to go over the buyer broker contract. And it's going to be a great way to make sure that, first of all, we don't waste our time with showing homes with people that don't respect what we do. And also, it's going to make sure that we outline the terms of exactly what we're going to be doing for this prospective buyer, and really, establishes that professional, stance. So before we get into today's presentation, Bill, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Yep. Good morning, Kevin. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And so we are going to be joined by Lauren Noack, but I don't see her yet. She might be having trouble getting in.
Yeah, I forwarded her the link, so hopefully she's jumping on now. While we're just Debbie's a little bit under the weather today, so we're giving her the week off, but I'm going to do a quick mortgage update. I was kind of looking at the markets this morning, Kevin, and I've noticed that the 10-year Treasury has ticked up quite a bit, and you can see it there on the chart.
Yeah.
Especially in the last few weeks. And it looks like the Fed is walking back some of their rate cut language. And so that is kind of interesting to see. I'm just going to kind of read something here to everybody. It says the Fed has repeatedly said it's looking for data to show that inflation is easing sustainably and that the overall economy is cooling before starting to cut interest rates. But Powell on Tuesday indicated that policymakers had not yet reached this point. And it says earlier in the week, the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank President Mary Daly said there was no urgency for rate cuts to begin. And so, the comments they're saying are field questions about whether there may be fewer rate cuts than expected this year and whether they may begin later than anticipated. So that makes me a little bit, a little irritated, but, it goes back to having solutions for financing. And I think when Debbie brought up last week about the 3-2-1 buy down, the 2-1 buy down, having solutions again, where I feel like we kind of, as rates were kind of coming down a little bit from their highs, we kind of forgot about that as a useful mechanism to provide some relief on payment. Maybe even though they need to qualify at the start rate, a couple of years of having a lower payment does allow people to get into the market now. And we got to just hope for the best that these rates do come down eventually here, and hopefully by the end of this year we start seeing that. But just keep that in your back pocket, that those buy downs are very, very useful tools.
Whoops, I was muted. Sorry about that. I'm just over here
no problem.
myself. So yeah, that tick up right there is definitely concerning. And we'll see what the Fed does there.
Awesome. Do we have Lauren in queue here?
We do have Lauren. So let's bring Lauren Noack on the line here. Good morning, Lauren. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm well, thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to stop my screen share here, and you can have at it. And so, of course, Lauren is our compliance officer as well as the owner of TC Advantage. And so, Lauren, give us a little background.
Yeah, so I've done a similar presentation on this before, but I think that was more hypothetical. And so we're gonna go a little bit deeper today. But essentially, I am here to talk about the buyer representation forms. Again, like Kevin said, my name is Lauren Noack. I am the owner operator of the TC Advantage. I'm also a licensed agent, CAR certified as a transaction coordinator, CAR certified as a forms trainer, and also on the board of the California Association of Transaction Coordinators. So we are well versed in in this subject. So a little bit about today's presentation. Again, this is more specific to these buyer representation forms. And again, I'm going to attempt to kind of educate you guys on their function and then empower you to use them. There is a lot of conversation out there right now around hypotheticals or around assumptions about what the industry is going to look like come July. But it's important to note that there will be a new and revised forms release in June. So at that point, I think a lot of what we're going to go over today will be changed. So it's important to keep in mind that up until then is it's important for you guys to be practicing these conversations with your clients, staying informed on what you have available to you now, because this has been in the news, because there have been these conversations around it. This is what we have to work with in the basket now. So we're gonna go over a couple of these elements today.
And Lauren, I think too, it's just really important to start getting in the habit before it becomes kind of a full-blown requirement.
Exactly.
We have this kind of lead time here to start thinking in these terms, knowing what's coming down the pathway. And if we start doing these better, best practices, best habits now, it's not such an abrupt change of behavior down the road, right?
Right. And it's about getting ahead of it and not being like having a buyer consultation or even a seller, listing consultation and being like, I hope they don't mention it. I hope they don't mention it. Like, we want you to be empowered enough to be like, hey, have you heard about this? Let's have a conversation about it. Here's all the accurate information, because I know the headlines are kind of scary and a little inaccurate. So yeah, that's definitely the goal. Because in California, we have been ahead of the game in this context for the most part, and we'll touch on that as well as we're kind of going through it. So yeah, because the buyer broker agreements aren't new. And again, the whole reason that we're talking about this is because of the verdict that came out of Kansas City, Missouri on Halloween of last year. And this was a lawsuit against NAR and Home Services and Keller Williams, where the claim was that there was a conspiracy to inflate commissions by enforcing a cooperative compensation rule. So basically requiring listing brokers to offer compensation to buyer brokers, effectively setting like a price floor for commissions and then therefore inflating seller costs. So by saying like, oh, you have to put something in the MLS, or, oh, you have to, what do we put here to offer the other agent? It implied to sellers that they had to put something there. And so that essentially was what the whole lawsuit was about. It wasn't necessarily on the grounds of, why do I have to pay the other guy's agent? It was, you're implying that I have these additional costs that aren't necessarily there. And so that's important to know kind of going forward, is that really the basis of all of these changes is transparency, and is having these conversations and, giving consumers, buyers and sellers as much information as possible. Which again, as you'll see, we kind of already do, but here you go. The other thing to note was that this lawsuit and then that verdict were state specific. So it wasn't a national or a federal court. If it was in federal court, then it would have had nationwide implications. The proposal is obviously they're proposing for these nationwide changes, but just the individual results from this lawsuit, or the verdict from this lawsuit, was just state specific. So and the Department of Justice has been keeping a close eye on this case as well, and a lot of the other copycat cases. So again, so much can change by July. Okay, so the proposed settlement, right, which came out in mid-March, which NAR released their whole statement about it. The settlement, again, is still subject to court approval. But essentially it would resolve all the claims against NAR, over 1 million NAR members, all state, territorial, and local realtor associations, and then all the association-owned MLSs, and then all brokerages with a NAR membership or NAR member as a principal with that did residential transaction volume of 2 billion or below in 2022. So it's they tried to get it to cover everybody, but it doesn't. And again, the hope of this settlement being that all the other copycat lawsuits would go away as well, because as we all remember, immediately after the verdict on Halloween, that same attorney launched another case. There was also one involving Carr. And so they want to try and, get this all cleared up. Some of the key terms in this settlement proposal include a release of liability for everybody that I just previously mentioned. And again, it's important to note the agents affiliated with home services, and I think Keller Williams, any of the related companies and employees, they aren't covered either because they still have their ongoing settlements. So, but the two main points that will affect agents in this settlement, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about already, is the removal of any cooperating compensation offers in the MLS and the requirement for a written agreement between buyers and their agents. And it seems scary, but again, these have already been available. When you have a pocket listing or you have a listing, something that's not on the MLS, you receive offers like you're not getting the compensation listed on the MLS. So we already have a process for submitting, a CBC form or making sure that the compensation is for the buyer's agent is there, or conversations are had. So again, it sounds scary and a big shakeup, but we already have this stuff in place, and lucky for you, that's what the rest of this presentation is about. So, a couple of reasons around utilizing these buyer representation agreements now, before they are a requirement, is that, there's this big stigma around them because for so long, one of the biggest sales pitches to get buyers to use an agent is that, oh, my services are free. The seller pays for my services. And so now we have the task of kind of reframing that conversation and really showing the buyer the value of buyer representation and agent services. The concept of a buyer's agent wasn't always the norm. It wasn't until 1988 that the California legislature implemented agency disclosure requirements. So up until then, the seller and all of their interests were represented by the agent. And then the buyers were just considered customers. So again, it's kind of one of those things with when you have so much fast-paced evolving technology and industries that you forget just how recent it was that buyer's agents were actually a thing. So I think it'll be a little bit easier to change minds and reframe the conversation than a lot of people are worried about. Again, the buyer forms aren't mandatory. So as a buyer's agent, why do you want to use these now? Maybe you have been or want to avoid being taken advantage of by a buyer that has you show them a bunch of homes and then just writes an offer through another agent. Maybe there's a disagreement between you and another agent on who actually showed the buyers their new home and who's entitled to the commission. You can have this buyer representation agreement to sort of back that stance. Maybe you want buyers to feel that you're committed to them, or maybe you want them to show you that they're committed to you. Maybe you're tired of low commission splits offered by listing agents that think you just open doors. Maybe you want to see how almost all other professional relationships begin with and utilize a documented agreement. Attorneys have retainers. We're dealing with legally binding contracts. This is not a radical idea or concept. So maybe you want to avoid being named in a claim regarding non-disclosure of compensation. And then obviously the best reason is to get ahead of any of these legal changes and to be prepared for that.
Yeah, all of the above, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Pick your poison on how you want to frame it for your specific buyers in that conversation. So now we know if the buyers are required to pay a commission to their agent on top of all of their other costs associated with home buying, it would spell disaster. And that's kind of where a lot of these concerns are. Obviously, the great news of Fannie Mae, saying that those concessions don't count against the full concessions is super helpful. And that's great news. But the current system of sellers paying agents to bring them a qualified buyer, I don't think is going to change anytime soon. So the key, again, is just to be more transparent about the process. So here's kind of the best way to wrap your head around it. The buyer signs this BRBC form, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, with the buyer's agent, with their agent. And this form is all encompassing. It actually is a merge of 3 other forms that were previously used. So this new version came out, I want to say a year ago, where they kind of revamped it as this lawsuit was kind of, there were rumblings about it. They came out with this kind of updated form. So, okay, so the buyer signs this agreement with their agent, and let's say this agreement for the agent services is for 3%. Buyer's agent says this is all of the things that I do for you. This is what the cost of my services is. It's 3%. Great. Now, separately, you have a seller that signs their RLA, the residential listing agreement, with their agent, the seller's agent. So let's say that is for a total of 5%. And again, whatever your listing appointment conversation is on how you get to that number, that's for your conversation. But let's say it's for that total of 5%. So from that 5% total, the seller's agent or broker will designate an amount to offer to a cooperating agent, right, to bring them a qualified buyer, because you can represent the buyer, you can bring your own buyer, and typically that results in a lower commission. A lot of agents will be like, oh, if I also represent the buyer, it'll be 4% commission, or, whatever. Again, it's all negotiable. These are all conversations to be had. But if you want to have another agent, which is the smart way to go, represent a buyer and bring them a qualified buyer and have 2 professionals in a transaction, then you're going to offer some of that 5% to that agent for that work. Okay. So again, if it's not on the MLS, you can use the CBC form as well, the cooperating broker compensation form. Now, that 2.5% goes towards the 3% cost of the buyer agent services. So now this leaves the buyer with another 0.5% that they would be responsible for paying to the buyer's agent. So now they don't have to pay 3%, they only have to pay 0.5% because their agent's getting 2.5% from the listing broker. At this point, perfectly acceptable for escrow and the lender to be notified of this additional buyer cost. Proceed as usual. Great. Or the buyer can ask the seller to pay that extra 0.5% by requesting it on the RPA using the additional SPBB form, which we'll get into in a minute. Again, remember, at each of these points, there is an option for negotiation and conversation. There's pros and cons to each scenario, but this is an option if your buyer is not able to or doesn't want to pay that 0.5%. They can ask the seller to cover it. The other thing to note is that when you're a listing agent receiving an offer from a buyer, don't skip over this section. This is one of those times where a single checkbox can make or break a transaction. Okay, so if the seller agrees to cover the buyer's 0.5%, then that is in addition to the 5% that they've already agreed to pay the listing broker, and it gets paid directly to the seller's broker. So you wouldn't modify the listing agreement to show 5.5% total, because the listing agreement is just talking about what is going directly to the listing broker. Is this making sense so far? So this is,
Absolutely
again,
making sense, Lauren.
okay, good. It's one of those things where you just kind of have to do it a couple of times to get the flow. So I'm glad this is being recorded so people can go back and kind of rewatch it.
For sure.
Okay, so now let's get into these forms and how to fill them out. So the first one we'll discuss is obviously the BRBC, or the Buyer Representation and Broker Commission Agreement. The first thing to note is that the representation period on this form is calculated in days. So not a start date and an end date like your listing agreement, just X amount of days after the start date. This is also a non-exclusive agreement by default. You can select to make it exclusive in the next section, but they figured this is a little bit more disarming to most people. And again, these are a lot of points that you can bring to your buyer's attention as you're going through this form with them, which you should be. The next item asks about any pre-existing relationships. Again, it's okay if they exist, but they need to be identified or disclosed. And this is in accordance with NAR's Code of Ethics. So we'll see later on in the presentation as well that there is a form that the buyer would receive upon cancellation or expiration of this agreement that they can then hand over to, if they decide to go with a different buyer's agent, that satisfies this kind of agreement. And then Section 3 requires a sort of definition of the property to be acquired. Now, too narrow of a description, and it might not be protective enough, but too broad, and that could also be problematic. So the one important thing to note is that if you leave this blank, it could be unenforceable entirely. And remember, again, this is an opportunity to have a conversation with your client about what exactly they are looking for. Nobody wants their time wasted. So take this section seriously. Use this as an opportunity, in conjunction with your presentation to go over the specifics of what your buyer is looking for. Moving on to Section 4, you can see that the very first sentence in bold is a reminder that compensation is negotiable. And this is something that is throughout a lot of the California contracts. So, and has been for a while. This is something, again, you can point out. But this section is where you identify payment or compensation for your services. The default is that it's a percentage of the purchase price. Or you can check the second box for a flat fee. I know some agents that do manufactured homes or some of the smaller price point homes, they'll do a flat fee. So you can do that. Or you can check the third box for an attached compensation schedule. So if it's like, if we find a home within this price range, it'll be this percentage, or if we, if it's an agent in my brokerage, it's this percentage, whatever. You can have like a whole separate page that has all these different variations in compensation. This is an either or scenario. Do not check multiple boxes. Just pick one, and that's what this agreement will be based off of. California law also requires this notice about exclusive relationships. And then this is where you can check that box too, to change from the default of non-exclusive agreement to an exclusive one. It also defines the expectations for involvement. The broker is only entitled to compensation if the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker, or if the broker showed the property to the buyer virtually, like FaceTime video call or something like that, or the broker submitted to the seller a signed written offer, or the property was introduced to the buyer by the broker. It seems vague or kind of all-encompassing, but it does specifically call out agents, saying that just sending your buyer a list of properties doesn't count as broker involvement. So it's not that broad.
And Lauren, we have one quick question.
Sure.
So Albert asks, so being non-exclusive, does that mean the buyers can go and use another agent?
Yes. Yes, they can. But again, they still, again, currently, come July, they're going to have to sign an agreement with another agent, and there's all these other things tied to it. but they do have that option currently.
Got it.
And then there are also things we'll get into as far as expiration and cancellation of this agreement. There are differences when it is non-exclusive or exclusive as well. So there are things to consider when deciding on what works best for you and your business and your client. Okay. We're going to skip item C and come back to it. But for now, section 4D talks about what happens to this agreement if the buyer, what happens to this agreement of the buyer paying a certain amount if the agent ends up getting paid another way. For example, the listing side is offering cooperating agents this commission. 4D1 explains that if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited toward the buyer's obligation to pay compensation. Again, if you remember from the previous slides, that's how we landed on the buyer only being responsible for the 0.5% out of that original 3%. And then in 4D3, you see the default is to give authorization to include a request in the buyer's offer, asking the seller to pay the difference. If the buyer doesn't want that, you can check a box to remove authorization, but it's a good idea to kind of leave this open because you never know what sort of properties your client's going to want to make an offer on once you get going. Because again, this agreement should be signed before you show any properties. So it's possible that leaving this overage as a buyer obligation, right? Not making it so that you can put that in the offer for the seller to pay. It might cap them out when it comes to, what they're able to pay cost-wise. So you just kind of want to leave that option open. But again, this is have a conversation with your client, whatever works best for them. And again, it's changed a little bit because of the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rules allowing this to not count against lender credits and caps and all that kind of stuff. But it's still something to keep in mind, especially if we're getting into the more competitive season. Okay, let's hop out of the BRBC form really quick and see what that looks like having the seller, asking the seller to pay. So here in the RPA, the purchase agreement, at the top of page 2 in section 3G3, there's an option to check a box stating that the seller agrees to pay the buyer's obligation of commission to the buyer's agent. That's it, just the one little box. You don't have to write it in. You don't have to give an explanation, just check the box. It's very easy to overlook. It also incorporates the SPBB form into the contract as well, and that does require signatures from both parties. So it's a checkbox and an additional form that then incorporates this into the contract. Paragraph 18, which is referenced in that sort of second column to the left, in this section also mentions that the seller is entitled to a copy of the written buyer representation agreement, but only the section that talks about the compensation. So if you have other terms written in or things like that, they don't get a copy of the whole agreement, just that part where it's like, okay, prove that you agreed to pay them 3% and that whatever, so that they are allowed to request a copy of that. Okay, so that SPBB form, this is another one-page form. It's very straightforward. It outlines very clearly when this form should be used. The very first section here states, do not use this form if there is no buyer representation agreement in place. Do not use this form if the amount the listing broker is offering already covers the amount in the buyer representation agreement. If you have signed an agreement with your buyer for 2%, then you can and if they're being offered 2.5%, then that's it. That's all you have to worry about. Hold on just a second. Okay. So, and then also don't use the form if the buyer's broker or if you as the buyer's agent are waiving that shortage of commission offered. So if you're like, you know what, I know we have an agreement for 3%. It's a really competitive offer situation. Don't even worry about it. I'll do it for 2.5%, not the 3%. You don't need to use this form. Don't give it to the seller. Don't write it into the contract. Don't check that box. Then this lets both parties know one more time, again, that commission is negotiable. And then the next part can be easily messed up, but really it's simple math. 1 minus 2 equals 3. Section 1 is letting the seller know what the buyer's obligation is. This is the total amount that they have agreed to pay their agent in the BRBC. So in our example, we would put in 3% in section 1. Section 2 is confirmation of what the seller's broker is offering the buyer's broker on the MLS or that's agreed to in the CBC. So section 2, you would fill in our example, 2.5%. And then section 3 is the difference between the two. So that's the amount that the buyer is asking the seller to cover. So section 3, you would write in 0.5%. And then again, both parties need to sign it to make it binding. Okay. Jumping back into the BRBC form, we are on section 4E, and this is a sort of safety clause for the broker. In the same way that the listing agreement has a section entitling the listing broker to commission even after the listing expires or cancels, this agreement has one as well. It does have its own requirements, however, in order to be implemented. The agent must provide the buyer a written notice of the properties where there was broker involvement prior to the expiration of the agreement, or within, there's a time specified if the agreement is canceled. They have like a little buffer after cancellation. So really it's important to stay on top because again, the agreement is in number of days. It's not like, oh, okay, you really have to stay on track with when this agreement is going to expire and make sure that you get them a list of broker involved properties prior to that. And CAR, of course, has a form for that called the NPIB, which is the Notice of Broker Involved Properties. So if this agreement expires or the buyer cancels, and then they purchase a property that you were working with them on, and it falls within this designated time frame that you filled out in section E, then you would be entitled to the compensation. Again, same way that the listing agreement works. And with that, so now let's jump back into section C and talk about the cancellation of this agreement. Because even if we're looking at a non-exclusive agreement, people always like to have a clear way out. Commitment is scary, so let's not scare them more than we need to. First is that either party can cancel this agreement via written notice. There is a CAR form, of course, for this cancellation, and that's the COBR, or the cancellation of buyer representation, and we'll look at that in a bit. If this is a non-exclusive agreement, which is the default, then the cancellation is effective immediately. However, if the box was checked to make this an exclusive agreement, then the cancellation takes effect 30 days after receipt of the notice. And this is important to note as well because, again, this BRBC form is not just about commission. It is about buyer representation. So if you have an exclusive agreement that's been canceled and you are in that 30-day time frame or period, then you are still bound by the representation fiduciary duty elements of this agreement. Also, if the broker intends to activate that safety clause, then they have to deliver the written list of properties within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. So again, if it's non-exclusive, it cancels immediately, and they have 5 calendar days after that effective date to deliver this list. If it's exclusive, they essentially have 35 calendar days to deliver the list, because the cancellation wouldn't be effective for 30 days, if that makes sense. Okay. Let's look at those two forms now. So first, this cancellation of buyer representation. Again, this is not just a cancellation so the buyer gets out of paying the agent and their broker. This is a termination of representation. And this form just reiterates all the terms from that previous section C in the BRBC. And honestly, it might be a good idea at this point to even include a copy of this form in your presentation to the buyer. This can serve as that notice in writing. They have this form already. They can use it at any time. Again, we just want to try and make this concept a little less scary. But essentially, you have a section that states either party can cancel this agreement, lays out the effective date of the cancellation based on it being exclusive or non-exclusive, which we just went over, and points back to that BRBC agreement in determining the terms for any compensation. So again, if you filled out that section for days after that sort of safety clause, it references back to that. What this form adds to the equation is clarification that there is no continuing right to representation. So again, this is if it's non-exclusive. Even if they open escrow on a property shown by the agent prior to the cancellation, the agent doesn't have to have anything to do with it. So you can still get compensated. There's a scenario where this is a non-exclusive agreement. Your buyer goes nutso, which we've all had happen. You have delivered the list of properties. They go into escrow. You can get compensation for that transaction, and you don't have to be their agent. You don't have to represent them. And here, if you check that box, that applies. Again, this is the if the terms need to be different from what was in the BRBC. So you have on page 2 of this cancellation, option A, to specify the broker involvement. You can either fill out this little paragraph here saying these are the properties we looked at, or you can attach a list. This section B outlines the expenses that occurred. C is for the broker to receive a referral fee. If you're like, look, I'm going to hand this off, I'm going to get a referral fee for it. You're kind of modifying the terms of that commission agreement within the BRBC form. You can check box C. D is if the seller's going to cover the agent's compensation. I would not use this if you're looking to waive the difference in commission from the seller, because again, it cancels the representation. It's not just the commission obligation. So in the forms trainer, forms trainer training, and talking with the car attorneys, they're like, this terminates everything. So I wouldn't really use it as casually as to say like, oh, it's being covered by someone else. And then box E is if the buyer owes nothing to the broker. If you're like, forget it, clean break, have a nice life. And then F only applies to an exclusive agreement, and that entitles the agent to compensation on the purchase of any property that falls within that representation period. Any questions on that so far?
I see no questions.
Cool. Notice of broker involved properties. This again is a straightforward one-page document. This applies to that protection period after an agreement expires or by unilateral cancellation. You can list the properties or you can attach a longer list. And again, there's also a reminder to the buyer to provide this notice to a new broker if they enter into another buyer representation agreement. And then there's a section to verify the date of delivery. So just kind of really straightforward, gives you some verbiage to present to the client. Okay, now going back again to that BRBC form, we're only on page 2. Sorry. And at the very top, you see section F, which outlines kind of a lesser known element of this agreement. And that is that the broker will disclose to the buyer, either prior to writing an offer or prior to showing a property, if that box is checked, the amount of compensation the broker expects to receive. Luckily, for now, this can be done by just providing your client a copy of the MLS listing or the CBC form, or you can use another new car form that they have, and that is called the ABCD. Yeah, I can't make those up. I feel like car has like this inside running joke that they do for their car form names. So again, this is definitely one of those elements that's going to change and get revised come June, in anticipation of them being removed in MLS, or you're gonna have to get really familiar with this ABCD form, and utilize it. So ABCD stands for the Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure. Is this an obnoxious form? Yes. Is it still a good habit to get into with buyers? Also, yes. Remember, we're looking to reframe the conversations around commission, destigmatize it, be as transparent as possible. So first you have a disclosure to the buyer that compensation will be paid to the broker, and that the cost of commission, whether direct or indirect, has an impact and an effect on the seller's final decision to accept an offer. That's the whole disclosure part. The buyer can sign there and be done. Now the grid below has an option for initials from the buyer if there's no MLS printout provided. But again, it's for now, this is optional. So this can be a really helpful display to certain buyers and demonstrates the fluctuation in commissions offered across similar properties. Then at the bottom, you can take the transparency one step further and fill in your final numbers of commission that was received at closing. So I've not seen this form used at all yet. But again, every once in a while you get those clients where this would be really helpful. And if anything, getting familiar with this form and the points it makes will allow you to maybe even rework it in your own sort of presentation or workflow.
For sure. And Albert says, which buyer in their right mind will pay compensation to their agents on top of their down payment and closing costs? Oh, Albert, it's all about rephrasing the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, it's not new. I mean, really, it depends on, again, how you reframe it, because you could also say the buyers have always paid the commission for their agent, because without the buyer bringing the money, the seller has nothing to give to the agents. So
Right.
it just depends on how you want to look at it.
Exactly. Reframe the conversation.
Exactly.
Just a tad. And that's what this is all about, because you're right. If you just walk into the room and just, all right, here, that's not what this is about. This is about breaking this up very, very methodically. And so the buyer says, yes, I want you to represent me. You are a good, fit for what I'm trying to accomplish here. And I want your, professional opinion on how to go about this transaction.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think it's something that the more you do it, the easier it'll be. But if you can come to it informed and not a deer in the headlights of like, I don't know, we can talk about it later, or maybe there's a form, I don't really know how to use this, but if you're like, yeah, absolutely. Let me show it to you first. Let me give you a breakdown of what this is, and here's a copy. You can look at it and get back to me, or, that having that confidence is going to go a long way. And also making it not as big of a deal.
And one more thing to that, Lauren, it's like you said early, is that there's a lot of information in the headlines. And so people are reading their newspapers, people are on, hearing their news and their different media outlets. have opinions on this, and they might not be entirely accurate or really dig in deeper to the realities of this stuff. And so if you're facing that with a potential client that think they've already formed an opinion, you better know how to overcome that and explain it to them, because you're already going to be up against already a formalized, crystallized, viewpoint.
Yeah. And I always recommend to my agents, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it as well, but the Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, the former FBI hostage negotiator. He's amazing, and I use his tactics on my toddler and on clients and in every element, and it really it helps get to the root of, where the real issue is and where that lies. And then again, the more informed you are, you can help guide your client and figure out what the real issue is and not necessarily take things personally. So yeah, just time to fine tune those negotiation skills. Okay. So back again to page 2 of the BRBC, we have section 6, which outlines what the broker may and will do in accordance with this agreement. And in perfect timing, if you're having trouble articulating your value as a buyer's agent, this is a great section to dive into and elaborate on all of the things that you're expected to do, that you're committing to your buyer to do in this agreement, from standard showings, writing offers, negotiating terms, scheduling inspections, attending those inspections, and even to providing the buyer a list of vendors to help in their investigations and working with them on financing requirements with lenders. That is an expectation of a buyer's agent, and that's what you're agreeing to and committing to your client in this BRBC form. So then that leads us to the next section that talks about what the buyer's responsibilities are under this agreement. This is, again, an agreement. There are two parties involved in this. So we've established what the agent's job is. Now, what's the buyer's obligation? Specifically, getting all necessary personal and financial information over within a certain time frame. So if the buyer, it just kind of lets them know, like, you're going to need to be available. And if somebody asks you for something, you need to deliver it in a timely manner. Don't drag your feet. Get as prepared as possible. They're agreeing to do that in this agreement. And then also, if the buyer doesn't qualify, that actually gives the broker or the buyer's agent the right to cancel this agreement in writing, of course.
Do you have a question here?
Yeah.
So the question is, so if you make an offer and sellers counter that they don't want to pay the extra 0.5% for a 0.3% total, then who decides on proceeding with the offer when no one wants to pay the extra 0.5?
Your buyer.
Buyer, right?
I mean, that's a conversation again between the buyer and their agent. If you've had this conversation with your buyer beforehand, there should be an element to that conversation of this exact scenario. What does that look like? You have buyers, every once in a while that are like, I want to pay you more, like, I don't care what they say, like, I'll cover it. Let's ask. If you don't ask, the answer is always no, right? But, let's just ask. If they say no, that's fine. We'll cover it anyway. Or maybe as the agent, you're like, you know what? I don't want to lose this deal. I don't want to lose this client, what have you. Or you can say, well, unfortunately, that's the cost for my services. I think that's going to be a really interesting evolution with all of this, is how that plays out and how those conversations are had. Documentation wise, you don't need anything because they've just removed that element from the contract. And again, you should still have that representation agreement in place. That shouldn't get canceled because of that, but it's a conversation to be had between you and your client for sure.
Yeah, and we've been, we're just starting to train on, educating our buyers, what
Mhm.
we do, and
Mhm.
really being able to articulate that properly, even in even in some collateral materials and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think you can also practice these conversations with, again, just your traditional role play with family, with, um, your your cranky aunt or uncle, or, somebody that is standoffish, somebody that and just say, if I come to you, let's have this conversation and have it out, in more of a lower stakes scenario. You kind of get a feel for it. So it's about staying well informed and confident in the tools that are available to you, and yeah, 100% educating the client, especially if they get all of their education from news headlines.
And Lauren, we watched a video a couple weeks ago with the CRMLS
Mhm.
lead counsel and the CEO, and
Mhm.
it was their opinion, and I have to agree. I mean, they were saying that they believe that yes, things are changing, and the compensation field is going to disappear, right?
Mhm.
It will be a requirement to have a written agreement, right, representing a
Mhm.
buyer,
Mhm.
but that 90% of all transactions will still more than likely be commissions paid by the seller. It's
Mhm.
just we're going to just operate in a different way,
Right.
and it's going to be a little different process. You probably have to get some information before you submit your offer and find out
Yeah.
what and if anything that they are prepared to do, and if not, what do the terms need to be if that needs to be built in, right?
Yep.
And then also monitoring some of the updates, which I will be doing as well. And if you've already confirmed this, Lauren, and you brought it up earlier about what the Fannie and Freddie will
Mhm.
allow moving forward for concessions, and things like that, because if we have FHA buyers, obviously, right,
Yep.
typically they're coming in with 3.5% or more down, but typically they're first time home buyers. And then also VA buyers who don't have to come in with any down payment, they're
Yeah.
100% financing. So
Yeah.
you can see where those two types of financing and buyer profiles will have challenges potentially coming up with an extra 15, 20, whatever the number is.
Right. Well, then you're in a situation that's ripe for discrimination, because, people are going to say, "Oh, well, I don't want a VA buyer," or I don't, I mean, there's already stigma attached to those financing types anyway. And so I think, it's
that's a
definitely something to keep in mind as well.
that's a fantastic point. And so yeah, they're gonna and as Lauren mentioned as well in the beginning, it's a proposed settlement right now. It's not done, it's not finished. They have a pretty heavy lift here.
Mhm.
And we're creeping up to we'll be in July before we know it. So
Mhm.
even though we anticipate it being in that time frame, it may take longer uh to get through all this stuff. There's just so many components to it.
Yeah. And the other thing too, like I mentioned, is the DOJ's involvement, and they had previously, um kind of resolved their investigation into this aspect, but there have been back and forth in the courts of like giving them authorization to sort of reopen it and relook at it. And, if it's something where it's like this will cause too much of a disruption, this proposed settlement will cause too much of a disruption in the housing market, or, things like that, they can also kind of put a foot on the scale as well. So much is up in the air, so much can change. And again, this is really just to prepare you or educate you on what is available currently, and how you can move forward based on what we have available right now, and ways that you can kind of, again, reframe this conversation.
Right.
And Lauren,
Uh,
as part of your TC service,
Mhm.
do you help agents with this, or is this part of your overall service?
I mean, we definitely aim to be a resource for our agents, but this is one of those things where it happens sort of before our involvement. And in the drafting of contracts and signing of contracts and negotiating and all of that stuff, we usually get involved after. So not typically.
Okay.
We don't draft contracts.
Yeah. And so I think from a broker standpoint, obviously Lauren knows this stuff. She's taken the time to educate herself on this. You know, make sure that if you don't have somebody like Lauren as a resource, that your TC that you may be using is up to speed with all this stuff, because you know, as our industry gets a little bit more, I'll use the word complicated, or we need to adjust. You really want to make sure you have somebody that is on top of it, on the ball with these changes, and that can be a resource for you. You know, if you just have someone that, you know, just kind of is, you know, taking disclosures and uploading them, but is not really a resource, but you're paying for the same amount of money for someone who could be a resource,
Right.
you may want to rethink who you're using, because this is real stuff, and this is your income, this is your livelihood, and
Your
you know,
license. Yeah.
and your license.
Yeah.
So
And a side plug, I guess, for the California Association of Transaction Coordinators, there is an option to search for TC members, but it's important to know that we have a membership requirement. All of our members are required to carry their own E&O insurance, and they're also required to provide evidence of California education. So whether that's a real estate license, car certification, and then they're required throughout the year to also, similar to, you know, agent licensing requirements, maintain that education. So our members are held to a higher standard. And, you know, that's definitely one of our goals, is because we combat that, where the TC industry is so unregulated, I guess, that anybody can just say I'm a TC, and you don't really know what that experience or background looks like. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there to make sure that the person that you have providing your risk management and compliance services is qualified to do so.
yeah, so I know some of you are using Lauren, some of you are using some of our other recommended licensed TCs. But Lauren, if you'd like to put your contact information up on a slide, or I know Kevin can put it out in the replay as well. Like to at least plug your services here as well. Obviously it's very evident. Lauren is very, very, very well versed in this stuff. And
Forms are my jam. So
yeah, I know. And I use her too. So like, you know what I mean? Like, you know, I'll have discussions with Lauren about a certain situation or a certain document, because, you know, we don't know everything at all times. And sometimes a discussion is helpful, you know? So it's important to have those resources.
Yeah, definitely. And we're almost done here. I only have another slide or two, but just finishing up this concept of the buyer obligation. The other item you'll see 7E is buyers also obligated to notify the broker of any material issues that they may have going into this process. So again, that's always been kind of like an understanding, but this makes it contractual. Like, you need to tell me there is a form, BMI, buyer material issues. If there are things that the buyer very specifically is important to them in their purchase process. So this says you're agreeing to tell me what these are. And then again, finally, CAR has some really great resources on this topic. There is a one-page quick guide you can find at car.org. That goes over the misconceptions about buyer representation. And I can show you guys too, if you want, on where to find all of these kind of quick guides. There's also a really awkward video on YouTube from Carr that actually has some great insight from 3 different agents and how they use these forms, and how they incorporate them into their processes. And then there's even a Carr's resource called the Smart Zone, and that has scripts, it has marketing tools, infographics, and it has that favorite list of 167 things realtors do for their clients that, again, can help you find and articulate your value to clients when using these forms. And again, that's it for me. That's my contact information. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, thank you for that resource for the, I like, I think it's good to see how other professionals are using the forms. So I like, that was the YouTube, right?
Yeah, yeah. They have the realtor video vignettes. Let me see if
Vignettes. I like that. Vignettes.
yeah.
But I think that's a really good, when we talk about, having those conversations and overcoming the objections and some of the disinformation out there. If you kind of can, watch some of these short videos of how agents are able to basically turn into a positive, you'll have a lot less friction, a lot less objection to what you do and what you provide and how we get there.
Exactly. And I'll pull up here. I put in the chat too, the site, but smartzonecar.org. And they have their YouTube that you can link to. They also have, again, like their scripts, the 167 things. So like, again, all just a whole long list of things that you guys do for your clients, and it kind of puts it there. And then I'll show you the yep. So you go to Transactions Center, and then up here you go over to, I think it's risk management. Yeah. Oh, you know what? Maybe it's under transactions. They move it. Hold on. I always find it. Oh, legal tools. Okay. So yeah, so it's under risk management, legal tools. And then these are all of their quick guides. And so there's one here that's the buyer representation agreements. They just released this month. And again, it's like a 1-page little helpful blurb. But then there is another one that is correcting misconceptions about buyer representation. And this one has like videos and a slide deck presentation, and this is their quick guide for that, which is, some facts and myths and things like that. So those are a couple of the resources that are really helpful that you guys can kind of poke around and are available.
That's great. I will include those in the replay when I send it out.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for this presentation today. It's always important for us to stay on top of it as a brokerage and stay on top of it through the risk management, angle. And, we will revisit some of the new form changes with Lauren, probably in maybe late June, right? Or somewhere in that.
Yes, they usually give us as forms trainers, we usually get it maybe a week or two training before they make it available to other car members. So as soon as I get that training, I'll reach out and we'll get there as soon as possible. You can also just pop it up here. If you go to car.org, oops, car.org again. Under risk management, wait, hold on. Again, standard forms. Okay. Transactions, standard forms, form revisions and new form releases. So you can see they did kind of like a mini release in March. There were some forms that they had updated. December was kind of the bigger one. There's also going to be in June, we've seen drafts. The listing agreement is going to be completely redone. It's going to have a grid format, just like the purchase agreement. So everybody's going to have to get familiar with that too. But this is where you can find kind of a quick summary guide. You can also find actual redlined copies of the forms and see what those look like. So you can see, I don't know if there were a lot of changes on this one. Yeah, so you can see in red like what they've changed and updated on all the documents. So again, that's another really helpful resource to stay updated on what those most recent changes look like. And that's where we just, as TCs, just always kind of check back here to be like, did they release it yet? Did they release it yet? And so this is where you'll find those copies as soon as they have them to release.
Amazing.
Yep.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. This is why we record it, or Kevin gets this out for review. And agents, if you missed a few things in there, I know I probably could go back and listen to it again and maybe even a third time. But that's why we do record it, and it is a good thing to go back if you have a few minutes and just kind of run through it again. But as a brokerage, we want to make sure that we're up to speed, up to date with all this stuff, all the changes, of which we are, and we have a great team here at Alta Realty Group. And so we thank you for attending. And I don't know, Kevin, if you have anything further.
Just that, as usual, we just hope you guys get out there and make it a great week, a productive week, and can't wait to see you guys all on the webinar next week. And next week, we will be going through our new CRM system. So that'll be really cool, especially for some of you that haven't employed a CRM. This will be a very cool training. So looking forward to seeing you guys all next Wednesday on the webinar. Bye-bye.